Jesus never backed down from calling out sin and hypocrisy. Last Sunday and the Sunday before that, we heard gospel stories of Jesus being challenged by his opponents. Jesus responds to them by calling out their hypocrisy. In this week's gospel, Jesus does the same. He never backs down from calling out sin and hypocrisy. Now, I don't know about you, but I feel a tiny little bit called out by two parts of today's gospel reading. The first is the part about having the best seat. I think I sit up here mainly for convenience, so I don't have to go back and forth up the stairs. I'm more than happy to go up and down the stairs. I am pretty mobile. I do yoga. I go to the gym. I can go up and down the stairs. So maybe that's something for us to think about. But I also sit up here because the chair is up here, and I guess it's part of your tradition, and I want to honor that. So I sit up here. But to be honest with you, my first instinct is actually to sit down there with you. I know of ministers who actually do that in churches. And I think it's a bold statement for sure. What do you think? You can talk to me about that after our service. The second part that I feel called out about is having a special title, like pastor. Now, I think you've noticed that I prefer just being called Mark, not Pastor Mark. But I'm open to whatever you call me. So if you want to introduce me as Pastor Mark, that is fine. But even when I taught in college, I preferred my students calling me Mark. I even tried to get away with that in elementary school when I was a teacher, but my principal was like, no, Mark, you can't do that. In my mind, honorific titles like father, pastor, reverend, or even mister have a way of separating us from people, putting one person above the other, and that's why I don't really like using them. But I also heard how these titles are reminders to clergy of their role to serve. Wouldn't it be interesting if you introduced me as, this is Mark, our servant? That's a bit odd, isn't it? But perhaps in keeping with what Jesus commanded today. In today's gospel, Jesus called out the hypocrisy of faith leaders who placed burdens on others with their rules and laws that they themselves never followed. Jesus called out the hypocrisy of faith leaders who placed burdens that got in the way of people loving and worshiping God. I think, as many Christians do today, that Jesus would not get in the way of people loving who they are called to love, even if that's a person of the same sex. I think Jesus would not get in the way of a person choosing a name they want to be called or a pronoun that more authentically reflects their God-given dignity. It's a little fighting, isn't it? I think we are being hypocritical when we enjoy rights and freedoms and yet seek to take them away from the most vulnerable people in our society. Jesus never backed down from calling out sin and hypocrisy. He never backed down because he wanted for people like you and me to have as free and full a relationship with God as he did with his Father in heaven. Jesus never backed down from calling out sin and hypocrisy because he wanted us to have free and full access to God's love. You might recall Jesus saying to his disciples, "Do as they teach and follow it." This reminds us that the Jewish law was not rejected by Jesus. He's telling his disciples to follow it. Now, we Christians cannot ever think that the Jewish law was wrong or to be rejected. That type of thinking is what's called supersessionism. It's a fancy theological term to describe that the new covenant of Jesus superseded or replaced the Jewish law. Supersessionism has been part of church thinking for a very, very long time, and many theologians have come to see that that's one of the causes of anti-Semitism, that is, hatred of Jewish people. But most Christian churches, including ours, have rejected supersessionism. Instead, we speak of the new covenant of Jesus not replacing the Jewish law, but fulfilling it. After all, Jesus followed the Jewish law. After all, our Bible still has the Old Testament in it, which contains the Jewish law. The New Testament does not displace or replace the Old Testament. We maintain it and see Jesus' new covenant in light of it. Back to today's theme, Jesus never backed down from calling out sin and hypocrisy. Last week, you might recall, I shared 8 ways that we can love ourselves so that we can love others and therefore love God. This week, I propose 4 ways of loving ourselves. 3 of them sum up Brené Brown's 8 suggestions from last week. By the way, if you missed it, feel free to watch my sermon on YouTube. The 4th way of loving ourselves comes from the Old Testament. The 3 terms that sum up Brené Brown's 8 suggestions are these: longing, openness, and surrender. And embedded in all of this is vulnerability, right? Longing, openness, and surrender. I won't go into those today. What I would like to look at is the 4th way of loving ourselves, and that is littleness. Littleness. One of the key themes of the Old Testament is anawim. It's a Hebrew word meaning the poor little ones. And throughout the Old Testament, God favors the anawim, the poor little ones. Jesus in the New Testament continues this theme. A few chapters back in Matthew chapter 18, they asked Jesus, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus calls a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." Jesus calls us to be humble, to be poor little ones. You see, poor little ones seem to naturally love themselves. Poor little ones seem to naturally feel loved, to naturally know that they're beloved by God. Poor little ones don't stress about their sins or failures. Poor little ones don't reject gifts and love freely given to them. As a teacher, visiting kindergartens was always my favorite thing. Because even if I was a stranger and visited them, there was a natural openness. There was a natural warmth. They never were held down by their failures or faults. They were just naturally open. In Christian spirituality, there is a practice of littleness, as the name implies. Every day, we think about ways that we feel little. And these little ways enable us to receive God's love more freely and easily. Thank God, who sends Jesus to teach us to be little. Thank God, who sends Jesus, who never backs down from calling out our own self-hatred, our own guilt and shame, our own pride, things that make us feel big. Thank God, who pours out grace in us and calls us to receive it in little ways every day. I had mentioned to some people that this past week I did an exam for my PhD. And this exam is a 24-hour open book, choose 3 of the 6 question essay responses. So I needed to get out of my house because I have 4 roommates, 2 dogs. And so I booked a hotel room and I had all my books laid out and I had my computer screen that I brought. And I had spent 14 straight days with my head in the books, thinking about all these theologians. And then I get my question. And it's easier than expected because there are 3 short essay questions, but I wasn't ready for two of them. So thankfully, I had a friend email me his login to the U of A, and I was able to access ebooks that way from the room. But I mention all of this because all of the theologians that I studied all focus on how we understand being a church community. That's called ecclesiology. So I'm supposed to be an expert in ecclesiology, an ecclesiologist. And one of the ecclesiologists was someone that I have never met, but we have communicated. And he had asked me to write an article for him. And so I did. And then I realized that he wrote one of the books that I had to study. And his book was entitled Stumbling into Sin. And in this book, he talks about how, as a church, we are sinful. If you look at all of Paul's letters, he writes of a lot of division, infighting happening in the church. Part of what it means to be church is that we fight, is that there is sin, and we can't back away from that reality, he says. If we don't, then we run the risk of feeling too great, too perfect. In fact, for about 500 years, the Catholic Church, in its official theology, believed itself to be the perfect society. And it wasn't until the 1960s that theologians were like, time out, that's not true. We have caused division and harm. And so this theologian, Brian Flanagan, says, we first have to look at our own sins. We have to look at our littleness. And we have to repent of those sins. Because when we do that, only then can God's amazing grace enter us. Isn't that neat? That we recognize now that part of who we are is that we're not perfect, is that we are not holy, that we are sinful. But recognizing that makes space for God to fulfill us, to make us holy, to heal us. There's one last point I'd like to mention about this gospel, and it comes to us through Zen Buddhist wisdom. And it goes like this. Everything we do as Christians, from coming to worship on Sunday, reading the daily lectionary, doing good deeds, are all fingers that point to God. So the end goal is not Sunday worship. The end goal is not reading the daily lectionary. The end goal is not doing the good deeds. The end goal is God. They're all fingers pointing to God. Sometimes we worry too much about the things that point us to God, rather than our actual relationship with God. Sometimes we worry too much about the things that point us to God, rather than relishing and feeling God's embrace around us. Jesus never backs down, even when we focus on the wrong things. Jesus calls us to love him, to love God, who we find in our deepest, truest selves.